Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here at 9 a.m. on a Sunday. It is my pleasure to facilitate this discussion today with two brilliant scholars and artists. My name is Ghada Al Khater. I'm a writer and associate at the Arab Gulf States Institute in DC. We're a research organization, Foreign Policy Institute, focused on the Gulf, and I work specifically on art and culture and society. So this topic is very near and dear to my heart. I'm sure it is for you all as well. So, without further ado, I will introduce our panelists. We have Ghada Al Khater, who is a multidisciplinary artist. Her practice spans political cartoons, or Artooning as she calls them, as well as public installations and sculpture. She has exhibited widely in the Gulf, in Kuwait and Qatar, as well as in Russia, China, and France, where she was a resident at the Cité Internationale des Arts. And Ghada also worked in acquisitions at the Qatar Museum, as well as part of the World Cup team to kind of brand the city and dress the city, which she will tell us more about in her comments. We also have Dr. Roberto Fabri, who is an associate professor at Zayed University in the UAE in the College of Arts and Creative Enterprises, and he is currently a fellow at the Aga Khan Institute for Islamic Arts, Program for Islamic Art or Architecture. He has also taught at the Center for Gulf Studies and at the American University in Kuwait, as well as in the University of Monterrey, Mexico. And then more on a practical side, he has worked on the UNDP program for architectural preservation in Kuwait, as well as on the Modern Heritage Technical Committee in the UAE. He's also a scholar specifically of Kuwaiti modern architecture and has written numerous volumes on that and on Gulf architecture more broadly. So we will get started. I think in order to frame our conversation today, it would help if you could both talk about how you come to heritage and your different practices. So Ghada, in your creative work, what does heritage mean to you, and how is that something that you manifest visually? Because it's rather an abstract concept, so please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. I would like to begin by thanking Diwan team for organizing a brilliant conference of like-minded people across different fields who have gathered in this conference. The question of heritage is a question that follows me in my journey, in my artistic journey. So I'm a Muslim first and foremost. I'm an Arab second, and I'm Qatari third. And I grew up listening to my elders having a sense of nostalgia to the golden age of Islam, where Arabs have presented numerous amounts of knowledge, innovation, and discovery, and that we're bearing the fruit of it to this day. And I feel like I've always been, I feel like in this day and age, Arabs are trying to catch up and having a sense of nostalgia to that. And we've also witnessed the West coming in, intellectualizing our history, documenting, archiving, etc. And I feel like one of the greatest elements that I find fascinating is time. So Arabs during that age invented one of the first instruments of telling time super accurately, which is the astrolabe. And in that, they were so connected and deeply rooted to their land that they owned time, and time did not own them, which is a product of modernity today. And they understood the seasons, the stars, everything, and understood migration, when and how to do it. Farming, science, astronomy, all came together in that time. And we now live in an age where we are almost completely disconnected to our land. And it's something that is so important to us Arabs. And this is what I would like to kind of revive, is that through my work, and even in a small amount, just referring to knowledge that existed, tying things to our land, going back to that and driving and enforcing inspiration and creating cultural artworks and artifacts that actually cement and represent our history, that to this day make us proud. So yeah.
Yeah, and how does that kind of come into your work? If you have any examples that come to mind in your artworks.
Yeah. Again, the 3 points I mentioned, being Muslim, Arab, and Qatari, are the constant drivers. So I'm very much interested in the humanity of the Quran, just ethics and a way of life, and how that comes in. So basically recreating different verses in the Quran and visualizing them in a way that is understandable and relatable to people. So all of the heritage elements, I try to create cultural icons and make it relatable using cliches, iconic symbols, and also drawing elements of language and wordplay. So a lot of humor and that makes complex topics accessible and relatable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Professor Fabri or Roberto, in your research, how do you define heritage maybe on a more temporal scale? I think in the Gulf, people often see the pre and post oil heritage. Could you kind of talk about what that means for your research?
Yeah, it's not easy to give an answer after what she answered. I mean, you're making my life difficult now. It's important, but the definition of heritage is quite also difficult to resume in few words, and especially heritage in the Gulf. And as you know, Ghada was saying, I also have to position myself, right? I'm not from the region. I don't look or talk with the accent of the region, but I've been living in the region for the past 14 years. And that somehow addresses also the title of this panel, telling our history. What history am I supposed to tell? It's not my history, or it's not my story, but it's a story that I participated in at a certain point in time, a moment in time, etc. Heritage for the Gulf is specific, defined by traditional elements that are mostly codified as pre-oil life. What I'm arguing with my research and with my book is that the production of space and architecture that happened in the transformation years, thanks to the oil revenues, is as important as what of the symbol of the pre-oil life, because they are testifying the incredible transformation that happened between the 50s and the 70s and the 80s, where the Gulf cities became more present in the international scene, but also they became bigger and more articulated in terms of the urban fabric. These buildings that were produced during these times are the result of a series of interactions. They are not necessarily locals or foreigners. It's an exchange. And it's based on the same network of exchanges that always existed in Gulf cities, because it's mostly merchant cities, port cities, etc. And I'm arguing that the modernist city that happened is a consequence and is a result of all these exchanges, and therefore they probably deserve to be considered also heritage, because they are signifying that moment of transformation. It's not easy to have people accepting this in general, not only in the Gulf. Modern architecture is not considered heritage almost everywhere, but in particular in the Gulf. But there have been progress in the latest year towards this level of acceptance.
Yeah, and I think we have some examples on the slides here. This is what you categorize as modern architectural heritage, right, from 50s onwards, maybe in contrast to what people think they know as being kind of Gulf architecture, with like burjils and the maybe forts that are really common around the Gulf. So I think this helps to visualize that.
Courtyard houses, mud houses, and all that. Which, by all means, I mean, they represent the legacy of those years, exactly like these ones, are talking about other type of exchanges. This building is in Abu Dhabi. It's a bus station, and it's been designed and built by a Bulgar consultant or Bulgar group of designers that testify that moment in time in which the Gulf was having relationship with non-aligned country, or with the second world, as it was called at that time, namely the Soviet Union, for example.
Yeah.
There are plenty of other examples that are coming from, or buildings that are coming from Japan, Europe, US, South America. I mean, there was a big exchange, and gave to the cities also an international touch that is not always common in other parts of the world.
Yeah. And then kind of thinking about broader audiences outside of the Gulf, Ghada, in your work, how do you negotiate or navigate who your audience is in your work when it's not in the Gulf, and then how these symbols might be represented or understood for your audience, let's say in an exhibition in China or in Russia?
That's a good question, actually. Ever since I got my degree in graphic design, it's been so hard not to think towards an audience. My background before my degree was fine art, and usually it's just driven by emotion and your thought and generating an idea. But the way I would segment it is the difference in my work is between political cartoons and artwork that is intended for a public space or a museum. Political cartoons are meant to be understood first and foremost. The idea is important. The idea is the artwork regardless of execution. So if I'm creating an image about a certain event or a political issue or topic, it has to be, the cliche or icon has to be understood. And I'll give you an example. During the blockade in Qatar, my main audience were Qataris. So if I used cliches known to us in the country, it didn't matter that someone in London didn't get it. Versus creating an installation, it's not dependent upon understanding. It's dependent upon a different set of emotions and thought. So then here it's more about the topic that you would like to express and say in your way, in your artistic expression. And you basically hope that whether people like it or not, find or, it sparks thought.
Yeah, and in your work, I think you discuss how political cartoons or your art in general gave you a sense of an ability to talk about kind of more sensitive subjects,
Yeah.
especially around the blockade. What did art afford you in that sense, or your cartoons?
I think the biggest thing I understood just from that moment in time is how much people censor themselves. Because I think if anyone can say or do anything, if they say it elegantly and eloquently. And of course, using humor. I think we have a lot of stereotypes about Arabs, but I think what the international audience doesn't know is that we're funny. We can be funny, and we can take our issues very lightly if given the opportunity. And it brings a sense of understanding and togetherness. And most importantly, you engage in healthy discourse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so kind of going into the question of debates maybe, Roberto, in your work, would you say that there's a debate around if there is some sort of pan-Gulf architectural history or heritage, or are there specific nuances that people are not really aware of between different countries and its heritage, or their architectural heritage?
Labels. We need labels to understand, to categorize and understand the words around us and make it simpler. So yeah, we can probably issue a label for Gulf architecture for what it was. there are elements, they are recurrent in the region. There are people that were operating at the same time in different cities in the Gulf, and that makes it that the fact that some buildings are similar or they imply or implement the same technology or system or also shaped and aesthetics. There are also waves through which this architecture came to the Gulf, was produced and conceived in the Gulf. So there's definitely some threads around, but it's difficult for me to define, and I don't even want to define, what is Gulfi and what is not, what is Khaliji architecture and what is not, and probably it's not even my job to do that. So I'm more interested in reading and understanding this network of exchanges that produce that space, more than trying to get to a definition of, geographical definition of that.
Yeah, and I think those networks of exchange and you mentioned a lot of international architects who kind of help build the urban identity of the Gulf is also contributing to what I think people associate with the Gulf now, a very cosmopolitan international space. And so I think in that way it's also shaping the identity.
Yeah, but I don't want to, there's always the tendency to see this as an import. No, there's like everyone from outside is bringing knowledge or material to the Gulf. It's true that the Gulf needs a lot. For example, construction material. There's no construction material in the Gulf. Now even the sand is used to produce concrete, which is kind of
that changed actually.
Yeah, lately, yeah.
Yeah.
But what are we saying?
I can speak for Qatar. That's what I mean. Like recently, I discovered that there's a plant that produces complete concrete material or building block. I'm not familiar, but using sand and clay, etc.
Yeah. But because this problem is being addressed, and similarly, through all these exchange, architectural firms local architectural firms start popping up in the region since the early 80s, and they became bigger, and then it's not just from outside to the Gulf, but it's also a bijective relationship.
And going back to the question of labeling, Ghada, would you label yourself as, or do you identify with being called a Gulf artist versus a Qatari artist versus maybe an Arab or a Muslim artist? How do these categories shape how you identify yourself?
I struggled with this question a lot. When I saw it as part of the questions, I was like, oh.
You can say no.
No. Just with the sense that I struggled with the term artist. So in general, I find that for whatever reason in my life, I struggled with labels. So one of the first ones is graphic design. So one of the first things I did upon graduating from university is realizing that I didn't want to be a graphic designer. I didn't want to be hired as one. So I designed my resume so that I don't get hired to be a graphic designer, even though it says BFA in graphic design. It's having to deal with the prejudice and stereotype of any label. So for example, artist or designer or etc. I feel confined in that I have to be that and nothing else. Just because of the way I'm centered around my curiosity, and it, with every moment in time, drives me to different things. But I've never been called a GCC artist or Qatari. First, I think Qatari artist is the most prevalent example. But no, I haven't struggled with that actually.
Great then.
Yeah.
That's good. And so I think adding to this question of labels and identities, are there contemporary architects based in the Gulf who are adding to this heritage or changing what it means to have Gulf heritage or Gulf architecture today? How are maybe the new generation of Gulf architects navigating this space?
Tough question. heritage is always there, and every designer in every field has to deal with that and address it in a way or another. And I cannot speak for young architects in the Gulf, but from what I see from my point of view, I mean, they are also trying to make sense of what is considered heritage. And the answers, I mean, the response that I give, it's layered. I mean, some results are like more stereotypical, and they go into what, even Ghada was calling the golden age of Arab science, when you have geometry or muqarnas and all these elements that builds up into something that can be considered a contemporary reinterpretation of heritage. Some others are using more subtle layers of reference to certain shapes or certain materials or certain colors, color palettes, etc., which, in my opinion, is a second layer. It's an advancement. You don't have to have a direct reference to something of the past, but there's still reference to pearl diving and falcon hunting and all the typical legacy of a pre-oil life. It's not easy, but it's not easy for every designer and every architects around the world. I mean, even Italian architects, or my fellow, Italian architects are struggling to have a relation with the past and transform into a proposal for the present or for the future. So I think in this case, the Gulf is aligned with the rest of the designer in the world.
Makes sense, yeah. And so, Ghada, going to your other experiences, maybe some of the other work that you've collaborated on, when it came to the Qatar World Cup, could you walk us through what it means to brand a country's heritage and identity and to kind of produce it for international audiences in a somewhat commercial way? What are the elements that you think of? If you could just walk us through that process.
When I first joined the team, it was a very immediate sort of, you were put into it and you had to deliver something at yesterday very quickly and very effectively to a wide audience who all of them have a sense of how the country should be represented. So how do you create something? How do you create a brand that represents the country in one of its, actually the most important event it's hosted in its history, where you can please locals, but also the international audience. Here, audience became the first layer. And it was basically utilizing the same way I would tackle a cartoon, in the sense that it should be effective, understandable, etc., etc. And then also knowing football culture, that the audience is not, forgive me, an educated audience, and not necessarily, for example, intellectual, in the sense that they're here to attend the game and leave. Regardless, they could be people who represent many fields, but in that moment in time, that's what they care about. And it was more about simplifying the message. So basically, the idea was first to create a visual brand expression that represented Qatar in a way. And one of the ways we tackled that is to create a brand that is developed in building blocks. So you create a set of icons, a set of visual imagery, and a set of text. You give that Bible or Quran or whatever, that set of rules, you give it to anyone, and they should be able to create any sort of product or collateral they wish. Now, for the city dressing, it was completely different. So in terms of a brand, that was the approach. It was just building blocks. For the city dressing, it was designed to cater to every area in Doha and how people relate and how and they experience the city. So is it a walkable area such as Souq Waqf? Is it are you driving by it? Are you there? Is it a bougier place? Is it all these things they come into mind, and then you just work with a team and collectively address every aspect, and you do it in a way that is holistic, where you consider every aspect. So that was very interesting, knowing that these things have to come into place, not necessarily having a background or an experience in it, but understanding its value and its importance. Having, attended, for example, certain events and abroad, and the way that you can make them seamless and effortless.
I think, like you said, the audience obviously comes with its own imagination of what Qatar was. I mean, we saw this on social media, or people who were coming from maybe places where you have a very specific set of practices around football that you could no longer engage in Qatar.
Sorry, I would just like to add one important factor. Was in Qatar we have Qatar was pre-World Cup, showed up in a lot of news, a lot of articles, etc., good or bad. And there was this assumption that everyone knows Qatar, everyone knows it, of course they know it, of course, etc. But we had to work backwards, because we knew that regardless of that, every time we do travel, people don't know Qatar, they don't know where it is on the map, they don't know a lot about Qatar. The whole brand was built having knowledge that basically you're going to start from zero. So even the small elements that we were showcasing across Doha were just very simple elements that we started with, like just some of our animals, some of our heritage, some of our buildings. So yeah, that was a very important place to start from.
And how do you think these visual markers that were all over the city and on all sorts of branded elements, how do you think that shaped how people maybe left, or what impression they left Qatar with?
Oh, they loved it. The experience was remarkable, because and I'm not saying it just to paint a good picture. Like, you're there and you actually witness people being shocked for example, just how small and safe the country is. But then with animal heritage, we have like a wide range of animal life. So a lot of things presented culture shock at the smallest level.
So now switching gears to maybe the maybe official or government work in heritage architecture specifically. We've seen a lot of efforts in the past maybe 10, 15 years to preserve different kinds of architecture. So in Sharjah, you have the Art Foundation, which I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with art or architecture in the Gulf, but the Art Foundation has taken over numerous old merchant homes and turned them into art spaces. Or in Doha, the fire station is kind of an arts residency space.
It was in the picture before.
You'll see it, it'll come back. So how are governments participating in this renovation or attention towards architecture? And what do you think this means for maybe a more official narrative around this is our architectural heritage?
I think it's a work in progress. When I started working on this subject in 2012, 2010, something like that, there was no official narrative and no much interest. And I'm not saying that changed because of my work. It was a general growth in this part of the city. There's, as you said, there have been a lot of effort in heritage in general, in building an heritage industry also, to attract people. I mean, Qatar also did a lot and publicized a lot this effort during the World Cup, but also to keep tourism coming after the event. And that can be seen everywhere, and it can be seen also today in Saudi Arabia with the work they are doing with heritage and excavation areas like Al Hula or similar. Regarding the modernist city, that came later. At a certain point, some interest sparkled, and some governmental body expressed the desire to start preserving that. But to preserve or to understand what legacy a building can have, you have to study first. The first thing that has been done is a series of surveys to map where these buildings are in the cities, and because many of them are being demolished or are going to be demolished, and so that survey, I would say, took 5-6 years by different entities across the Gulf, of different people sometimes, and then I think Dubai announced in 2018, Dubai municipality, the decision to preserve a series of buildings. They are from the modernization era. Sheikh Rashid Tower, which is the World Trade Center, the first skyscraper of Dubai, and prototype kindergartens by Jafar Tukan, which is a Jordanian architect who was active in the region, and George Wright, another building. And Abu Dhabi municipality also had the Modern Heritage Initiative that started 2016, more or less, start mapping what are the survivors, I would say. And then lately in the UAE, we had this ministry initiative from the Ministry of Culture and Youth about extending this preservation across all the 7 Emirates, even including the Northern Emirates. And I'm happy to be part of this initiative with my humble contribution. In Bahrain, there's a lot of effort to preserve the island of Muharraq, which is a mix of old traditional houses and concrete intervention, and the Pearling Path is part of that, so that's also a remarkable effort. Qatar is doing his part. We saw the fire station in Ghada's peaks before. Other buildings have been renovated lately. There's been the Ministry of Interior, I think it was, that now is an old hotel. Yeah. The Sheraton Hotel at the end of the Corniche is still an hotel, and it's good that they're keeping not only the building but also its function together. So there are glimpses here and there of interest in these type of things. So it looks good. It looks better than it used to be before, but most of these buildings are sitting on part of the city that is very valuable. It's very valuable land because they are central and they are big, and they can build bigger, so they are always under pressure of real estate forces that prefer to take them down and build a bigger, glossy, shiny aluminum tower, like the stereotypical image of the Gulf, of some Gulf cities, right? So it's important that now some layers of preservation are put in place. It's still difficult because there's not much incentives for private properties to keep the building that way, but again, I'm positive that there's been a different direction in the late years.
Yeah. I'll just have one more question for the two of you, and then maybe we can open to any audience questions if we have any. Ghada, you mentioned that the question of nostalgia shapes a lot of your work. Is that something that you're seeing broadly among maybe some of the other artists in the artist community, regionally or internationally, or is that maybe something that feels quite personal?
I wouldn't say that nostalgia drives a lot of my work, but I think I'm a product of my environment and my culture, and I think one of the important, I'm going to touch up on like just a few points. One of the Arabs are known for being storytellers. Our history before many of the museums and institutions existed is an oral history. With the development of our National Museum, we struggled in the collection in culminating our artifacts and knowledge, because so much of craft or artifacts or existed in the brains of individuals. I would like to kind of relate that to a certain degree politically, because it's very important. With the genocide happening in Gaza, I think one of the greatest elements that has helped continue the discussion and discourse, whether through Instagram or talks or etc., everywhere, anything you see about Gaza and Palestine is because you have poets, artists, writers, and scholars who have archived every element of their history and their heritage, their craft, their plant heritage, their homes. Najil Ali is a cartoonist whose cartoons still exist today. You have poets, and you have Ghassan Kanafani, all these writers who are, and scholars who to this day are being referenced everywhere we go, who keep this discussion and this issue alive. And it's no matter how much they try to erase it and cleanse the buildings, people, plants, everything is being attacked. The one way you can preserve it is through knowing your land, archiving and keeping everything, and knowing who you are. Because if you don't have that and you don't document that, anything can be taken away from you in a glimpse, in a second. And I think that's very important, is to have a sense of value to our culture and heritage through archives, through writing, through documentation, and through art, and the many facets that help preserve a culture and a nation. I think this is the most important thing related to art in the GCC, at least today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and that's how you tell your story, if we want to be literal with the title. I guess one last question for you, Roberto. We think of heritage as maybe a more historical thing, but we are actively also producing our heritage, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Is there any project or maybe building or architect who you're really excited about because you see maybe that might be something that in 40 years, if you can tell the future, in 40 years, that might be
if I can tell the future.
If I don't know, maybe.
Would I be here if I can tell the future? Museums are dealing with this issue a lot, and building on what Ghada was saying, every museum that is coming up in the Gulf lately had to discuss this and decide how to represent it. And I would go even further. Ghada was talking about building collection inside the museums. I'm thinking about building the building before putting the collection together. In many occasions, the architects were given the task to design the envelope before knowing what would it be inside. That's happening, for example, these days in Abu Dhabi, in Saadiyat Island. They are building Sheikh Zayed National Museum, which is about the place, the region, the legacy of the founding father of the UAE, etc. But the building was conceived in 2008 or 2009, where there was no clear vision of where the pieces to be placed inside. So in that case, the architect had to be some sort of a cultural mediator to give a shape that could kind of predict the narrative of the museum itself. The National Museum of Qatar, it's a similar story from what I've, from my research. I was not involved. I'd love to say
otherwise, but yeah.
I'm sorry?
I'd love to say otherwise, but it is the same story.
Yeah, no, I remember interviewing people, and I would love to talk about that with you in over a coffee one of these days. But yeah, there was a different project presented, it was not accepted at the beginning, and then the desert rose came out as a representation of some sort of for lack of a better word, I'm calling a contextual linkage, so a connection to the territory. So that are the buildings I would probably use to answer your question. I mean, and more are coming because the museum are a big part of the what they call the soft power of the region. There are 4 or 5 new museums coming up in the Emirates. Qatar is also working a lot in that. Kuwait has a number of museums already in place and a national museum in the way. And Saudi Arabia, we all know that. I mean,
Great.
More.
Well, amazing. Thank you both very much for your insights and your experiences. Do we have any questions from our audience members? We'd love to hear from you. And then do we have a mic? Okay, we have a mic coming your way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Roberto, my question is for you. To what extent do you see, either traditionally or in more contemporary settings, there's an effort to sort of think about the natural environment along with the built environment as these architectural projects are being done? Is that something that really goes into the thinking or not?
We want to talk about sustainability now. That's
not necessarily just, I mean, maybe partly about sustainability, but also, when we talk about heritage, the physical landscape, the physical environment is part of sort of how I think architects sometimes think about incorporating heritage into their design. I'm just wondering to what extent you see this happening, or has happened, or has not happened in the region.
Yeah. It is happening. It's hard for me to read in which proportion this is participating to, and I mean every building site is a different story. They are pushing more towards this effort of preservation of the environment or a dialogue with the natural environment, and other that are not interest in this because they are like maximizing profit over a footprint of certain square meters. So it's difficult for me to answer your question. Is part of the equation, is more and more part of the equation. It has to be because Gulf cities are more and more engaging with this problem of ecological footprint. COP28 for good and the bad was in Dubai last year. So it has to be part of the equation and is considered, but not always, not all the time, not, there are still a long way, I mean, there's still something to be done to make this measure part of every construction process. Thank you.
More questions? All right, well, thank you. Oh, yes.
This question isn't really directed at anyone, but it kind of addresses more of what Ghada was mentioning with regards to the aggregation and collection of oral histories. Do you potentially see a future of like centralizing and aggregating all of these oral histories into national museums and sort of central centers, or do you potentially see a route where these oral histories can be more individualized and decentralized into different platforms?
With respect to the National Museum, for the 8 years before the National Museum opened, I think there was a team, a curatorial team, who sought different people that they've interviewed to collect knowledge that they have regarding the history of Doha, etc. There was also some efforts to revive certain crafts. I still think there's a lot more to be done. And I also think that artists and people shouldn't wait for institutions to actually do that. But it's not. But I also noticed that many countries are facing the same obstacles. So in Morocco, they recently discovered that they used to be producers of glass, like similar to Murano glass, and it's a craft that they saw was dying, and it was through this one artist that they discovered that they actually had that. And now they're trying to revive it, and they were able to find a few studios in an area, I believe a few hours away from Marrakesh. Anyway, and I guess this is important in every culture. In Afghanistan, it's carpet weaving. Glass is also big in India. I think every country is seeking to protect its craft because it represents a big part of their culture and heritage, and it's actually important for economic purposes as well, and cross-cultural opportunities.
I think also, like you said, individuals don't have to wait for kind of government approval to do that. There are a lot of projects on Instagram or TikTok that kind of seek to do this on a more grassroots level, collect stories from their families or from people in their community and spread them that way. So I think, people definitely feel empowered to do that themselves, and it helps to have the institutional backing, but it's certainly not a factor.
And the only difference is that Qatar is so small that it takes one generation to, for knowledge to be lost. Like, it's so small and so fragile that you don't know if something has been lost, which is sad.
All right, well, thank you both for your comments and your insights, and thank you all for listening very intently and sharing your ideas as well. We look forward to being in touch with you. If you have any questions for our panelists, please don't be shy on the sidelines. And thank you again for the Diwan for hosting us and for putting together this really insightful session and conference. Thank you.